Greetings, everyone. This is Sean Dyer from Mr. Dyer's Musings, coming to you today to talk to you about what is a mess. Now, we'll get into that in a little bit, but I just want to, as always, say thank you to my lovely wife and family for their unending support, and thank you for my students for keeping me on my toes, especially during this time. It's really interesting being a teacher right now. And I also like to thank all of you who are watching my videos and who are subscribing, commenting, and liking them. I sincerely appreciate it. Any feedback that you guys give me is always a welcome. So thank you very much. All right, so today we're going to talk about a mess. And I pretty much come from the direction of an officer. In living history, I've worked my way up from a private when I was 14 years old and I started into the hobby. And now I pretty much just do a surgeon's impression, either an assistant surgeon or a full surgeon's impression. But when you talk about a mess, militarily speaking, there are a few differences. Now, in general, a mess is a group of soldiers that come together to eat. Now, if you're an enlisted soldier, while on campaign, you might mess with a small group, maybe 5 to 6 people, and you would eat together. Each company was given a certain amount of mess chests so that they could cook in more of a stagnant camp. However, if you're an enlisted man on campaign, you're on the long march, chances are you're not going to have that mess chest to get to because you're constantly moving. So your soldiers who are enlisted, generally speaking, who got rations like salt pork, hard bread, or hardtack, might be a flour ration or a corn ration, could be salted beef, desiccated vegetables, etc. These are things that could be prepared rather quickly and ate on the go. In more stagnant camps, you tend to have a little bit heartier meals. Instead of hardtack, you would actually have soft bread. Instead of salt pork or salt beef, you might actually have beef on the leg or ham on the leg. Basically, they would just butcher the animals and they'd pass out fresh meat for the soldiers to cook. So there's a difference. If you're on the march, you're going to be given rations more like what we know today as MREs, or meals ready to eat, something that you can eat rather quickly with very little effort. If you're in a stagnant camp, it's going to be a different situation. Each company is going to have their mess chest so that they can cook, and usually there's just 1 or 2 people assigned that are going to be the camp cook, and you would walk up more like a cafeteria line and get your food. So if you are a soldier and you're campaigning, you might have a fry pan. Generally speaking, not everybody's going to need a fry pan. If nothing else, you'd have a plate, you would have a cup, and you would have your basic utensils: spoon, fork, and a knife. As an officer, though, even while on campaign, there is some differences. Mainly because as an officer, you were not issued your food. You had to purchase everything. Your uniform had to be purchased. Now, there are a few things that the government is going to give you, and I've discussed that in the past videos, like hay for your horse, straw, things like that, even firewood's going to be allotted to you. But as far as your subsistence, uniforms, and equipment, that's going to come out of your pay. So we can't really talk about an officer's mess without knowing kind of what direction we're going with pay. So via the revised regulations for the Army of the United States in 1861, I'm going to describe for you what a surgeon made in 1861. Now, as the war went on, the wages actually went up, even for the enlisted men. So according to the regulations, the assistant surgeon of less than 5 years service, which would have been most surgeons who are going into the military, they're going to get paid $53.33 1/3 per month. Your average soldier made about $12, $13. And if you're a state soldier, which means that you're enlisted by the state, you're paid by the state, there might be some differences. But later on in the war, it did get up to $17. So, but even then, $53 is a significant difference from the $13 or $12 that you're going to get as an enlisted man. Now, if you're a full surgeon, less than 10-year service, then you're going to get paid $80. That's a ton of money if you're a full surgeon, which is what I represent. So rank does have its privilege, but with that money, you're going to buy your own food. Generally speaking, I pull my details from two main sources. That is Dr. Brenton and Dr. Wilder. Dr. Holt is another really good reference, and he talks a little bit about the mess in it, not in the same detail as, say, Wilder or Brenton. There's a few other surgeons that have diaries and memoirs online and Google Books. They're free to read. But the thing is, when you're talking about the detail of how these guys are living their day-to-day, generally speaking, they don't really focus on those. They talk about who they messed with, so who did they have meals with, but they don't really talk about specifically what goes into that mess. Now, so surgeons, they have to pay for their own food, okay? Now, as an officer, you're expected to do your regular duties. So how are you going to have time to do all your regular duties and prepare your food? Especially when you're going to have to get it from the commissary or go to the Sutler and pay for it out of your own money. Officers were allowed to have servants, and there was actually a stipend by the U.S. government for each officer, depending on what your rank is, how many servants that you got. Most officers, from what I've read, usually only have about one. And when you get up to like a colonel or general, you might have several, but there's also other lackeys that will help those higher up officers. But Wilder, who was a captain for most of the war, he had one servant each time. In fact, the longest running servant that he had, his name was Frank, and it was a 10-year-old white boy. Generally speaking, when you look at pictures of officers and their servants, they tend to be African American descent, usually young boys or young men. But Wilder, he brought a 10-year-old white boy from Massachusetts and followed him through most of the war until his mom called him back to go back to school. Holt here talks about his servant and oftentimes how frustrated he is with his servant. Now, Holt's servant was an African American man. And Brenton doesn't really go into a whole lot of detail about his servant. He mentions them kind of just distantly. But he does talk about who he's messing with and the frequency and how does that all play out, especially when he talks about trying to find food. Okay. So, before we get too far into that, let's go to John Billings' Hardtack and Coffee. He does a great job describing what a settled camp would look like. And he said, John Billings was an enlisted man, just keep that in mind, in artillery. When the Army was in settled camp, company cooks generally prepared the rations. These cooks were men selected from the company who had a taste or an ambition for the business. If there were none such, turns were taken at it. But this did not often happen, as the office excused men from all other duty. When company cooks prepared the food, the soldiers, at the bugle signal, formed a single file at the cookhouse door in winter, where the cooks opened fire in summer, where, with a long-handled dipper, he filled each man's tin with coffee from the mess kettles and dispensed to him such other food as he was to be given out at that meal. For various reasons, some of which I have previously hinted at, the coffee made by these cooks was of a very inferior quality and unpleasant to taste at times. So, there you have it. John Billings discussing for an enlisted lining up at the cookhouse when you're at a stagnant camp, which is most of the time. most of the time soldiers are not actually on campaign traveling place to place. Usually there are breaks on long marches where soldiers are just going to be stagnant, and they have that opportunity. Okay, so officers had a couple choices. Like I said, they could use their servants to prepare their meals. Another option was to go to the sutler and dine with them. But what is a sutler? A sutler, as I described in one of my previous videos, was a civilian who is contracted out by the government to provide various sundries for the men. It could be food, could be soap, could be coffee, could be flour, yeasted flour. It could be candles, basically anything and everything that the military didn't give you, you might have a chance of finding it at the sutler to get it. Now, Wilder talks about his mess situation and preferring to mess with just a few officers, but to court favor with the other officers, especially the higher ranking officers, they tend to dine at the sutler. Okay, so what's a sutler? Here we go. Like I said, he's a civilian. He's going out and he's selling soldiers various goods. So Billings says, this personage played a very important part as quartermaster extraordinary to the soldiers. He was not an enlisted man, only a civilian. By Army regulations, sutlers could be appointed at the rate of one for every regiment, corps, or separate detachment by the commanding officer of such regiment, corps, or detachment, subject to the approval of higher authority. These persons made a business of sutling, or supplying food and a various collection of other articles to the troops. Each regiment was supplied with one of these traders who pitched his hospital tent near camp and displayed his wares in a manner most enticing to the needs of the soldier. The sutler was of necessity both a dry goods dealer and a grocer, and kept, besides such other articles as were likely to be called for in the service. He made his chief reliance, however, a stock of goods that answered the demands of the stomach. He had a line of canned goods which he sold mostly for use in officers' messes. The canning of meats, fruits, and vegetables was then in its infancy, and the prices, which in times of peace were high by the demands of war, were so inflated that the highest of high privates could not aspire to sample them unless he was the child of wealthy parents, who kept him supplied with a stock of scrip or greenbacks. That would be money. It can readily be seen that his $13 a month, or even $16, to which the pay was advanced June 20, 1864, through the efforts of Henry Wilson, who strove hard to make it $21, would not hold out a great while to patronize an army sutler, and hundreds of the soldiers, when the paymaster came around, had the pleasure of signing away the entire amount due them, whether 2, 3, or 4 months' pay, to settle claims of the sutler upon them. All right, so there you have it from John Billings. So the sutler supplied the men with niceties, right? Canned goods, etc. Like I do in most of my other videos, I'm going to go by rank and talk to you how the whole thing worked. I'm going to start with Wilder, and then I'm going to switch over and go back to another officer and come back to Wilder. So Wilder was a medical cadet in Washington, D.C. early on in the war. Now, as a medical cadet, he has some medical training, and he served in the general hospitals as basically as an aide. He'd go around, wrap bandages, tend to them. He actually did some surgeries as a medical cadet, and eventually he actually joined, this is pretty cool, Brenton at the Army Medical Museum. So Wilder, when he was a medical cadet, he would, generally speaking, dine with other cadets. Now, since it's Washington, D.C., they had what's called a barracks, a building there, and they would, generally speaking, eat together in the barracks. Every once in a while, they'd go out and they would go dine somewhere else. It's like a tavern. But generally speaking, they would dine at the barracks. Now, let's talk about Holt. Holt was an assistant surgeon, and he was a lieutenant. So that's above a medical cadet. And Holt discusses having trouble getting food. That's one of his frustrations. complains sometimes that he goes hungry, and that sometimes if he were an enlisted man, he'd be better off for it because of finding food. He always had to buy his own. I just don't think he was very well prepared. He complains a lot in his book. But Holt talks about eating very plainly. He tends to eat hardtack and butter, and he subsists off of that quite a bit. He also talks about a corn mush that he eats. Sometimes he talks about some other niceties that he gets, but for the most part, when he does talk about his food, it's very plain. Now, since he brought up hardtack, chances are he's going to the commissary, which is the government, not the sutler, and he's buying his own ration of hardtack. Butter is expensive, but he's not buying it by the pound per se. He's buying it in small quantities. And he does dine with other officers. Holt's not a very popular guy. So when he discusses dining with the other officers, you kind of get the sense that he's the odd man out. Now we're going to go back to Wilder, when Wilder joins the 55th Massachusetts, the colored regiment. And he comes in as a captain, as an assistant surgeon, and he later becomes a major towards the very end of the war. Wilder's a very popular guy. In fact, his best friend during his experience is the lieutenant colonel, Colonel Fox, and he tents with Colonel Fox, and he messes with Colonel Fox throughout most of the war. And in his descriptions, which is by far the most detailed and clearest, the examples that he gives, he talks about the foods that he's getting. He's getting canned beef from the sutler. He's getting soft breads. He's eating, he's using butter in various things. He talks about getting watermelon. A lot of soldiers and officers, since they like him, they actually give him gifts. He talks about, while he's down in Florida, how soldiers would give him snakes, and they give him a piece of alligator tail. So Wilder's experience is drastically different from Holt's experience, and a lot of that has to do with his popularity and how he's getting along. So that's Wilder's experience in brief. He's eating pretty well. He's doing a lot better than Holt. He's not eating a lot of hardtack and butter. And he's ranked up a little bit more. The next one is Dr. Brenton. Now, Dr. Brenton was the surgeon for General Grant out west. And then when he got transferred to Washington, D.C., and soon after, Grant actually came over and commanded the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war. So Dr. Brenton not only has the rank, he's a major, he's a full surgeon, he's an incredibly intelligent man. He's also he's eating with some of the highest officers that there are. And he's eating really well. He's talking about eating fresh beef and soft bread and drinking wine and brandy. And it's just almost a night and day when you compare Brenton's to Holt's. Again, Brenton's very popular. His rank does have privilege. He has a lot more money to spend than Holt. He also has a lot of friends in high places. He talks about his long discussions with General Grant quite often. He talks about the other high-up officers. At one point, he actually tented with General Sheridan. Now, General Sheridan wasn't the general at that time. He was actually responsible for the quartermaster. And Brenton and him slept together in the same tent. In fact, if it wasn't for Sheridan, Brenton would have been out for the night. So there's that experience. Rank has privilege, and you definitely see a difference in diet. Okay, so you have these officers like Wilder, who likes to mess in small groups. Now, when he does that, he's not eating as well. He's not eating some of the finer things, but Wilder's okay with that. He has a servant, he has Frank, and Colonel Fox, he also has a servant, and they're cooking for the surgeon and for the colonel while they're doing their duties. The Officers do have an officer's mess chest. Just like each company has mess equipment for when they're in stagnant camp, officers also have a mess chest that pretty much follow them very closely to the lines so that they can prepare their meals. Officers were allowed to have their own personal foot locker, so to speak. In that foot locker, they could have some like frying pans and some other niceties to make their experience a little more comfortable. But the mess chest for officers is going to be a little bit more well stocked. There are some surviving examples of mess chests containing some spices and things like that, but that's completely up to the officers. Now, if you are a living historian and you're an enlisted man or you're an officer, chances are you might want to have some type of seasoning. And there are examples of train spice containers that they would carry their spices in. Generally speaking, just salt and pepper, very basic, because spices are going to be expensive. The more exotic that you get. Okay, so there's the mess situations for both the enlisted and both the officers. We are coming up, we're in Passover right now, but the two celebrations, since most of the soldiers come from over like an Anglo-Saxon background or European background, there's a lot more Christians that are going to have their influence seen, except in very specific regiments that have a majority of one denomination or another. So since we're coming up on Easter, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about how soldiers messed during these celebrations. Now, Holt, in his book, talks about an extravagant dinner that they have during Thanksgiving. And Christmas is not so much. It's in the middle of winter. I think supplies are pretty hard. Even being as a surgeon, they try to make things nice for the hospital attendants, but they're not eating ham and turkey and cranberry sauce, etc., in great quantities. They do talk about on Thanksgiving having some turkeys that were donated by local population. Same thing with Wilder. In his book, he talks about Thanksgiving being a much more bountiful time when the soldiers were able to celebrate, enlisted and officers. Officers especially got treated really well when it came to that. They're talking about eating cakes and pies. They're talking about eating turkeys and goose. They're talking about some of the various other desserts that they're having. So they're eating hearty. Christmas, however, it's going to be nicer than your regular day-to-day ration, but it's going to be more meager. Instead of all the desserts that you're going to have, the number and quantity you're going to have at Thanksgiving, it's going to be reduced. So that's something that's interesting to note in case you ever decide to do a holiday, living history or something like that. Just keep in mind about what's available. All right. So that's my discussion about messes. So in my videos that I talk about, when I talk about an officer's mess, you're going to get your friends, your close comrades, and you're going to eat together. Both enlisted and officers are going to have very similar situations. On campaign, enlisted men, they are going to cook in themselves or cook in very, very small groups, like groups of 5, maybe upwards of 10, but generally speaking, like smaller groups. And they're going to have their own fire, and they're going to use their own skillets or plates and pans to cook on. On campaign, officers are going to have the luxury of having their officer's mess chest that they can rely on to cook. And they're also going to have their servants to cook for them. So that's one thing that's off of their mind. In a stagnant camp, it's going to be very similar for both. You're still going to have the servants that are going to be preparing meals for the officers, and the officers are going to sit around the same table, and there's a lot of pictures of officers sitting around tables, and they're eating. Wilder even uses some drawings showing, an area like a mess tent where the officers sit and they eat and talk business and stuff. Enlisted men, they're going to have a very similar experience, but instead they're going to have the cookhouses. And instead of servants cooking for them, they're going to have one or two or a few cooks designated from the companies and regiments that are going to be more permanent cooks. Generally speaking, they're going to be good cooks, and they get excused from all other duty. So it's a good reason to make your meals really good. and they're going to get their certain portion. Now, both officers and enlisted can go to the Sutler to purchase any other niceties that they want to. So if they want to get that Borden sweetened condensed milk, then they can go to the Sutler and get that. If they want to get that canned beef, like Wilder talks about, you're going to get that. If you need extra candles and or soap or whatever, that's what the Sutler's for. The officers, Wilder talks about eating at the Sutler's tent. And that was one way for the officers to get fed and still have that social thing. Wilder tended, along with Fox, tended to be on the cheaper side. He didn't like that idea. He liked eating in a small group, and it was going to save him money. He even complains about once he crosses over and goes to the Sutler's tent, how that's going to dig into his pocket. But it looks better on him and Colonel Fox, and it builds relationships, which is really important. Now, if Holt only knew and understood how important relationships were, then he would have definitely had a much easier time during the war. All right, thank you for watching my video. I hope it was educational and somewhat entertaining, and you got something out of it. I'll post citations to the books that I pointed out. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you have any points that you would also like to discuss about the idea of a mess, then please let me know. Leave a comment. I love reading primary sources. Anything that you can give me and share with me, it just helps me educate myself and helps me educate others and be a better living historian. And when I go to my classroom, it helps me be a better teacher. So thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, please like my video, and please share it around. During this time as a teacher, it's kind of different, so I'm using this as an outlet to get some of my teaching in. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Give your loved ones a hug and kiss. Happy Passover to my Jewish friends, and happy Easter to my Christian friends. Take care.